So Marvel kicked off their cinematic universe in 2008 with their first movie, Iron Man. It's directed by Jon Favreau, and it stars Robert Downey Jr. as our titular hero, Tony Stark. With them driving to something we don't know at this point, and it's just an automatic military ambush. Some jumbled shots go around, and we see Tony Stark is captured in the beginning. And it jumps back 72 hours and shows us how we got there. This sets up the premise of pretty much how our lead character, Tony Stark, ends up becoming Iron Man. Now, the really awesome thing that Iron Man does that Marvel has been doing really well since the beginning is how they pay homage to everything that came before them in the comics or games or even television shows if they had any, to give us like little Easter eggs, tidbits, and they'll take that knowledge and story and rework it into their own universe timeline, and they're really telling their own story. A really cool example of this is Tony Stark is held captive with a man named Yinsen in the original comics. Tony Stark at this point knows who Yinsen is, and it was someone that he greatly admired from college. Whereas in this movie, Yinsen is someone who he has met before at a conference years ago, but doesn't remember because of the lifestyle that he lives in the movies, where he's much more of a flamboyant, drunken playboy. But still very much the tech genius. And like they'll still use some original story beats, but they'll update it to fit in the modern world that we live in now, versus when these characters were first created. And a cool thing of how they show this off in a very subtle way is in the original comic, Tony Stark is visiting one of his international plants for a program testing. Whereas in the movie, he is heading a demonstration for the military. And he's doing that overseas in Iraq because that's a war that was going on at the time of filming of Iron Man. And it's really great is that they don't try to solve all of Tony Stark's problems in this. They actually allow him to evolve from one flawed character into a slightly less flawed character, which is, in my belief, really good storytelling, because it's extremely rare to come across someone who, is perfect. Tony is, he's a very obsessive person. He obsesses over his, not only his work, but also women in the beginning. And then, as he's going through traumatic events, and then he decides to change his life mission, he kind of shuts everything else out in his life and dedicates himself only to the mission of finding all of the weapons that have been sold under the table by his company without his knowledge, and to just blow it up. It also shows that he's not really willing to trust anyone new at this point, or anyone at all, really, based off of what happened. And this is before he comes to the realization that it was Obadiah that locked him out of his company, and also was the one who orchestrated his kidnapping. We also get to meet Rhodey, who is, one of his best friends, and he's, a very military-esque person, which, I mean, he should be. He's, like an Air Force commander. I don't remember his rank. I think it's a lieutenant. Don't quote me on that. But we get a good display of that when, during Tony's first test run, he encounters two military planes. And when Rhodey on his end becomes aware of the situation, he gives a call to Tony. Tony denies it at first, but then he admits it. And instead of, just letting everybody know who it was, what was going on, he kind of kept it all a secret for Tony, which, is something a military leader wouldn't do. That's something a best friend would do. Obadiah is pretty kind of one note, but with Jeff Bridges, chewing every scene that he's in as the character, you really just kind of get past Obadiah being one note, Now you can kind of see his betrayal coming, from a mile away, but you really don't mind it because Jeff Bridges is just so good at what he does. Gwyneth Paltrow as Pepper Potts. She gets a fair bit of screen time here too, and she does a really good job of establishing herself as, yes, her character may be like a secretary to Tony Stark, but she does much more than just all of that for him. She pretty much keeps him capable. She pretty much makes him a functional human being. Without Pepper, Tony would probably have starved to death long ago in his lab. While there may be some romantic tension between them, Pepper, her character, has made it kind of a rule for her to not get involved with Tony based off of his reputation and how she wants to be taken seriously. And Jon Favreau giving himself the cameo role of Happy Hogan is one of my personal favorite cameos, like little cameo roles ever. I was a pretty big fan of Happy whenever he shows up in the comics, and seeing Jon Favreau, who I've always been a fan of since Swingers, he's just great in the role. And all of this adds up to giving us some really great action sequences that really stick with you, and they don't feel empty when you're getting them. You feel really connected to them because you feel you're just connected to these characters and you're engaged in the plot and the story that they have going on. In the beginning, we get a small action sequence when Tony Stark is first kidnapped, and they utilize some shaky cam techniques here in the beginning that are very controversial. Most people are leaning on the side of not liking it, but it can be good when utilized correctly, and in Iron Man it's utilized correctly. The reason for this is because they only use it the once for the opening kidnapping scene to really help create the confusion, or help you feel the confusion that Tony Stark feels in this moment as well. The second action sequence is actually revisiting the first action sequence. It's just now in a more storytelling point of view, where they clear it all up for us now. We get to see more of what's going on with the action. And this is kind of the turning point of all of the action in the movie as a whole. Because from here on out, Iron Man will be introduced in the next action sequence. And from there on out, they really kind of utilize just steady, still shots, some swoops, little dynamic movements. But for the most part, they keep a clean, still camera to really let you see what's going on. The first scene that we get with the Iron Man suit, the Mach 1, with it being a fully wearable suit, when it walks out from the cave and we see it in its full glory for the first time, is really just a mesmerizing shot, just because of not only the memory I have of seeing that in the movie theater, but also just because of how powerful that shot, that look is, even when you just watch it now on television, just rewatching it, or watching Blu-ray. At a few points, the CG can look a little bit dated, but not really when you compare it to some of the cheaper endeavors with even modern day blockbusters used with just cheap CG effects. For the most part, I think that the effects have aged fairly well for an Iron Man, and I think that's really apparent when we get to the final fight between Iron Man and Ironmonger. And for the most part, Iron Man is, just a CG suit where, they had a couple of pieces that Robert Downey would wear on set, but he was, for the most part, just replaced in CG post-production. And that's how it's been done for pretty much all of his fight scenes since. They do a well enough job of mixing some practical effects and CG effects that it really doesn't ever breaks the suspension of disbelief that it's done so well of building in you. And then everything wraps up, pretty nicely in the end. And then we get kind of the last big bombshell from Marvel, where Tony Stark decides to not keep this all a secret. letting some of his, narcissism come through again. But that's really what set the tone for making Marvel's universe so different right up front. Well, we didn't know it was a universe. We just thought, it's really what made Iron Man so different from every other superhero movie that we have gotten beforehand. And then they opened up the doors to the whole universe with the first stinger at the end of the credits with Samuel L. Jackson walking on screen as Nick Fury. He delivers his awesome little monologue reciting Iron Man's end of speech and, drops, the tidbit of the Avengers Initiative. Thank you guys for checking this out. Make sure to tune in and look out for the next part in this Marvel Look Back series with Incredible Hulk. And at the end of all this, there will be like a whole essay, not like an essay, but more like an editorial coming out about pretty much going over the whole backstory of how the MCU came into fruition. Thank you guys. Hit the like and subscribe buttons. Check us out on our podcast, 28 Frames Later podcast, iTunes, Google Play, Podbean, wherever you get your podcasts at. And follow us on social media, 28 Frames Later. Thank you guys, and make sure to tune in.